Gabriel Stone was seconds away from signing the biggest deal of his life when a voice behind him said his name, soft, careful, almost like it didn't want to be heard. And in that single moment, everything he had built, every late night, every sacrifice, every choice that led him to that table, began to feel distant, because when he turned around, he didn't see a stranger. He saw the woman he had buried in his past, the one who had looked him in the eye 10 months earlier and told him she didn't love him anymore. The one who walked out of his life without taking anything but the silence she left behind. And now she was standing there, 8 months pregnant, balancing a tray in trembling hands, dressed in a uniform that didn't belong to the life he thought she would have chosen. And for a second he couldn't breathe, not because she was there, but because something about her presence felt wrong, like a truth had been hidden too carefully for too long and had finally found its way back to him. He had imagined this moment before, in quiet flashes he never admitted to anyone, moments where he would run into her again, where she would explain everything, where the confusion would finally make sense, but never like this, never in a crowded restaurant where million-dollar conversations were happening around them, never with her avoiding his eyes like looking at him would break something she was barely holding together, and definitely never with the unmistakable curve of a life growing inside her. A life that immediately raised a question he wasn't ready to ask, because the timeline didn't make sense, because the way she stood there didn't look like someone who had moved on. It looked like someone carrying something heavier than regret. And the more he stared, the more he realized that whatever she was hiding wasn't just about the past. It was something that had followed her into this moment, something she had chosen to keep from him even now. The pen slipped slightly between his fingers as the voices of his investors faded into a distant blur. Their expectations, the deal, the numbers, all of it suddenly meaningless compared to the weight of the question forming in his chest, because 10 months ago, she had left with nothing but a single sentence. No explanation, no argument worth remembering, just a quiet ending that didn't match the years they had built together. And now here she was, close enough for him to see the exhaustion in her face, the kind that doesn't come from one bad day or one bad week. The kind that builds over time, silently, until it becomes part of you. And he couldn't ignore the way her hands tightened around the tray, as if she needed something physical to hold on to just to stay standing. What he didn't understand yet, what he couldn't understand in that moment, was that this wasn't a coincidence, that the distance between them over the past 10 months wasn't empty time. It was filled with choices, with fear, with a truth she had carried alone for longer than she should have. A truth that had grown quietly while he built his empire, a truth that would force him to question not just what happened after she left, but everything that led up to it, every moment he thought he understood, every decision he believed was right. Because sometimes the things we lose don't disappear, they wait, they change, and when they return, they don't ask for permission to be seen. Before we go deeper into this story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because what happened next wasn't just about a man and a woman crossing paths again. It was about the kind of truth that doesn't reveal itself all at once, the kind that unfolds slowly, piece by piece, until there is no way to ignore what has been right in front of you all along. And for Gabriel, that moment, standing in a room full of opportunity with everything he ever wanted within reach, was the exact moment he began to realize that the one thing he thought he had lost forever might have never really left, and that the cost of not knowing the truth could be far greater than anything he was about to sign his name to. 10 months earlier, she stood in the doorway of the home they built together, her hand resting lightly against the frame as if it was the only thing keeping her steady. And she looked at Gabriel with a calm he didn't recognize, a calm that didn't match the weight of what she was about to say. Because when the words finally came, they were simple, almost too simple for something that would end everything. She told him she didn't love him anymore. No anger, no raised voice, no explanation that he could hold on to or argue against. Just a quiet certainty that left no room for questions. And before he could fully process it, before he could even decide whether to fight for what they had or let her go, she picked up her things and walked out, leaving behind a silence that felt louder than any argument they had ever had. At the time, Gabriel told himself it didn't make sense because it didn't, not after everything they had been through, not after the years of building a life side by side, not after the promises that weren't supposed to break so easily. But he also convinced himself that maybe he had missed something. Maybe there was a distance growing between them that he hadn't noticed. Maybe success had pulled him too far into his own world, and she had simply reached a point where staying was no longer an option. So he buried the questions the same way he buried everything else, under work, under ambition, under the belief that moving forward was easier than looking back. And now she was standing in front of him again, not as the woman who left, but as someone entirely different, someone quieter, more fragile in ways he couldn't immediately understand. Her presence carrying a kind of weight that didn't belong to a simple reunion, because nothing about this felt simple, not the way she avoided his eyes, not the way her hands trembled slightly as she held onto the tray, not even the way she said his name earlier, like it carried a warning instead of familiarity. And the more he looked at her, the more the questions he had buried began to rise again, sharper this time, harder to ignore. What happened in those 10 months wasn't just time passing. It was time filled with decisions she never shared, with moments that changed everything without him even knowing, and standing there, with the reality of her situation impossible to ignore, Gabriel couldn't stop his mind from going to the one question he didn't want to ask, the one that felt heavier than all the others, because the answer to it would change how he saw not just her, but everything they once had. Who was the father of her child? And why did the thought of that question make her look like she was bracing for something she couldn't escape? But even deeper than that, beyond the obvious, beyond what anyone else in that room might assume if they noticed her at all, there was something else, something in the way she carried herself, something in the quiet tension in her posture, something in the silence she chose instead of explanation, that suggested the truth wasn't just complicated, it was something she had been protecting, something she had decided he should never know. And yet here they were, standing in the same space again, with no distance left to hide behind. And for the first time since she walked away, Gabriel began to realize that the story he had told himself about her leaving might have been incomplete, because whatever she was holding on to now, whatever she had kept hidden for 10 long months, was still with her, still shaping every word she didn't say. And he could feel, without fully understanding why, that the truth she was afraid of him discovering wasn't just about the past, it was about something that had the power to change everything in this moment. Gabriel Stone wasn't always the man sitting in that restaurant with a pen worth more than most people's monthly income. He was someone who had built everything he had from the ground up, piece by piece, decision by decision, learning early in life that nothing was given and everything had to be earned. And that belief shaped the way he moved through the world, disciplined, focused, always thinking 3 steps ahead, always choosing logic over emotion, because to him control meant security, and security meant success, and success was the only language he trusted, the only thing that never changed its mind or walked away without warning. To Gabriel, love followed the same rules, or at least he believed it should. You commit, you stay, you build something strong enough to last, and no matter how difficult things become, you don't leave, because leaving meant failure, and failure was something he had spent his entire life avoiding. So when Norah became part of his life, he didn't see it as something fragile or temporary. He saw it as something permanent, something that would grow alongside everything else he was creating, something that would fit into the structure he had carefully designed for his future. She didn't ask for much, at least not in the way Gabriel understood. She wasn't asking for grand gestures or dramatic changes. She wanted presence, attention, acknowledgement, things that couldn't be measured or scheduled. And because those were the very things Gabriel struggled to give, the distance between them became harder to close. And while he believed he was building a future for both of them, she was beginning to feel like she was disappearing inside it, like her voice mattered less with every passing day, like her place in his life was becoming secondary to everything else he considered important. The night everything ended didn't feel dramatic in the way people expect endings to feel. There were no shattered objects, no raised voices echoing through the walls, just a quiet conversation that carried more weight than anything they had said before. It was late, the kind of late where exhaustion lowers defenses and truths come out more easily. And Gabriel, still focused on work even in that moment, barely looked up when she first spoke, not realizing that this wasn't just another conversation. This was the one that would change everything. When she finally said the words, they didn't come with hesitation. They came with a kind of calm that felt final. She told him she didn't love him anymore. And for a second he thought he misheard her, because nothing about that statement aligned with the life they had built. Nothing about it made sense in the structure he believed in. And yet the way she stood there, the way she didn't try to explain or soften it, made it clear that this wasn't something he could fix with logic or effort. This was something that had already been decided long before that moment. What Gabriel didn't realize then, what he couldn't see through the lens of his own understanding, was that those words weren't the full truth. They were a shield, a way of ending something without exposing the deeper reason behind it. Because the real reason she was leaving wasn't something she believed he would understand, and more importantly, it wasn't something she was ready to share, not with him, not with anyone. So she chose the simplest explanation, the one that would close the door quickly, even if it left him with questions that would follow him long after she was gone. And as she walked out that night, leaving behind a life that had once meant everything to her, she carried with her something far more significant than anything she left behind. Something that would change the course of both their lives in ways neither of them could fully grasp at the time. Because the truth she kept hidden wasn't just about why she was leaving. It was about what she had already discovered, something that made staying impossible in her mind, something that made telling him feel even harder than walking away. Because the real reason she left was something she never told him. The conversation around the table continued as if nothing had changed, voices measured, confident, focused on numbers that once demanded Gabriel Stone's full attention, projections, percentages, expectations carefully laid out by men who believed they were moments away from closing one of the most important deals of their careers. But for Gabriel, those voices began to blur into something distant, something secondary. Because across the room stood a reality he couldn't ignore, a reality that didn't fit into any calculation or strategy he had prepared for. And no matter how hard he tried to refocus, his attention kept drifting back to her, to the way she moved carefully between tables, to the way she kept her head slightly lowered, as if avoiding being seen was the only way she could get through the moment. Norah James didn't look like someone who belonged in that environment, not because of the uniform or the setting, but because of the quiet tension in her movements, the way every step seemed measured, like she was carrying more than just the tray in her hands. And when she finally approached their table, placing down glasses with a steadiness that didn't match the subtle tremor in her fingers, Gabriel noticed something he couldn't ignore, something that pulled his focus away from everything else completely. Her hands, once soft and familiar, now worn in a way that spoke of long hours and hard days, the kind that leave marks you can't hide. And it wasn't just her hands, it was her face, the exhaustion that sat just beneath the surface, the kind that doesn't come from a single sleepless night, but from something ongoing, something heavier. He tried to make sense of it, tried to align what he was seeing with what he thought he knew. But the more he looked, the less it made sense, because nothing about her situation matched the story he had told himself about her leaving. Nothing about this version of her suggested she had walked into a better life. And then there was the one detail he couldn't stop noticing, the one that made everything else feel even more uncertain, the timing. Because as he calculated it in his head, as he traced the months back to the night she walked out, the numbers didn't align in a way that gave him any clear answer, only more questions. When she turned slightly to leave, hoping to move past the table without drawing attention, Gabriel's voice cut through the space between them before he had fully decided to speak, the question coming out more direct than he intended. "How long have you been working here?" And for a moment she paused, not turning to face him immediately, as if she needed a second to steady herself before answering. And when she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, controlled, carrying a weight that didn't match the simplicity of the words, "long enough." And that answer, instead of giving him clarity, only deepened the uncertainty that had already begun to take hold. It wasn't just what she said, it was what she didn't say, the absence of explanation, the way she avoided his eyes even now. And the more Gabriel observed, the more the pieces refused to come together in any way that made sense. Because if she had moved on, if she had chosen a different life, then why did she look like she was still carrying something unresolved, something unfinished? And if the child she was carrying belonged to someone else, then why did the timeline feel so close, so uncomfortably close to the moment she walked away from him? And the longer he sat there, the more a quiet realization began to form, one that didn't come with certainty, but with a growing sense that something was being hidden, something that connected all of this in a way he hadn't yet understood. Something wasn't adding up, and Gabriel could feel it, not as a clear thought, but as a pressure building beneath the surface, a feeling that the truth was close but just out of reach. And as he watched her move away from the table, as he tried to pull himself back into the conversation he was supposed to be having, he knew that whatever this was, whatever explanation existed for the way things had unfolded, it wasn't something he could ignore or walk away from. Not anymore, not after seeing her like this, not after realizing that the story he believed might not be the full picture. And then, just as he began to turn his attention back to the deal, just as he tried to convince himself to focus on what was in front of him, she stopped, her movement breaking in a way that didn't match the rhythm of the room. And without fully turning back, without raising her voice, she said something that reached him clearly, something that carried more meaning than the words themselves should have, something that stopped him cold. Because in that moment, he understood that whatever he thought this situation was, it was about to become something far more complicated than he was prepared for. That moment didn't end when the conversation at the table resumed. It followed Gabriel Stone long after he left the restaurant, long after the deal was paused and the polite smiles faded, because once something no longer makes sense, it refuses to stay buried. And for Gabriel, the image of Norah James standing there, quiet, guarded, carrying a truth she wouldn't explain, became something he couldn't ignore, not with the questions now sitting heavily in his mind, not with the growing certainty that what he believed about the past was incomplete. And so for the first time since she walked away, he stopped moving forward and turned his attention back to the one thing he had avoided, her. What started as a simple attempt to understand quickly became something deeper, something closer to an investigation than a search for answers. Because the more he looked, the more he realized how little he actually knew about the last 10 months of her life. There were no clear updates, no visible connections, no trace of the kind of relationship that would explain what he had seen, just fragments, small details that didn't form a complete picture, and the absence of information began to feel just as significant as anything he could find, because it suggested intention, not coincidence. He started with the obvious, looking into where she had been living, where she had been working, who she had been around, expecting to find something that would explain the situation in a straightforward way. But every lead he followed seemed to open into another question instead of an answer. There were records of short-term jobs, places she stayed briefly before moving on, gaps in time that couldn't be easily accounted for. And while there were moments where it seemed like he was getting closer to understanding, those moments never lasted, because the details never aligned in a way that made sense. At one point, there was the possibility of someone else, a name that appeared briefly in connection with her, someone who might have been more than just a passing figure in her life. And for a moment Gabriel allowed himself to consider that explanation, because it was the simplest one, the most logical one. But the more he looked into it, the less it held up. The connection wasn't strong enough, the timeline didn't fit, and eventually it became clear that whatever role that person played, it wasn't the one he was searching for. It was a distraction, something that led away from the truth instead of toward it. What became clearer instead was something he hadn't expected, something that shifted the entire way he saw the situation, because the deeper he went, the more it became obvious that Norah hadn't built a new life after leaving him. She hadn't moved forward in the way he assumed she would. She hadn't replaced what they had with something else. Instead, she had stepped away from everything, from people, from stability, from any path that resembled progress, and the realization settled in slowly, but heavily. She didn't move on, she disappeared. That understanding changed the nature of his questions, because if she hadn't left for someone else, if she hadn't built something new in his absence, then her decision to walk away became harder to explain, not easier, and the presence of the child she was carrying became even more significant, because now it existed without a clear origin, without the context he had expected to find. And as the pieces continued to fall into place in ways that only created more confusion, Gabriel reached a point where the most obvious explanation no longer applied. There was no other man. And that realization didn't bring clarity, it deepened the mystery, because it removed the one answer that would have made everything easier to understand, leaving behind questions that felt heavier, more personal, more difficult to confront. If there was no one else, Then who was the father of her child? And more importantly, why would she leave without saying anything? Why would she choose silence over the truth? Why would she carry something so significant alone, and for the first time since that night 10 months ago? Gabriel began to consider a possibility he hadn't allowed himself to think about before, not because it didn't exist, but because of what it would mean if it were true. By the time Gabriel Stone found her again, it wasn't by accident. It was the result of days of searching, of following fragments that led him back to the one place he knew she couldn't avoid forever. And when he finally stood in front of her, away from the noise of the restaurant, away from the eyes of strangers, the distance between them felt heavier than it had ever been. Because now it wasn't just about what had happened in the past. It was about everything that had been left unsaid. Everything that had been carried in silence for far too long. And for a moment neither of them spoke, as if they both understood that once the truth was said out loud, there would be no way to return to what existed before. Gabriel didn't ease into the question. He couldn't. Not after everything he had uncovered. Not after realizing how much of her life had been hidden from him. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that matched the pressure building inside him, controlled but firm. If it's not someone else, then what is this? And the words hung in the space between them. Not just a question, but a demand for clarity, for honesty, for something real after months of uncertainty. And Norah James, standing in front of him, felt that weight completely, her composure slipping just enough to reveal the truth she had been holding back. She didn't answer immediately, her hands tightening slightly as if she needed something to steady herself, her eyes dropping for a brief moment before meeting his again. And when she finally spoke, her voice wasn't defensive, it wasn't angry, it was something far more difficult to face, quiet, unguarded, almost breaking under the weight of what she was about to say. You weren't supposed to find out like this. And in that single sentence, Gabriel felt something shift, because it confirmed what he had started to suspect, that this wasn't an accident. This wasn't a situation that had simply unfolded without intention. This was something that had been kept from him, deliberately. The truth didn't come all at once. It came in pieces, each one heavier than the last, each one forcing him to reevaluate everything he thought he understood, because the child she was carrying, the one detail that had created the most questions, the most doubt, wasn't connected to anyone else. It wasn't the result of a life she had built after leaving him. It was his, a reality that settled in slowly but completely, leaving no space for denial, no way to push it aside, because the timeline that hadn't made sense before now aligned in a way that was impossible to ignore. But even that wasn't the full story, because the truth didn't end with who the child belonged to. It extended into when she found out, into the moment that changed everything for her. And as she explained it, as she revealed that she didn't know she was pregnant when she walked away, that the discovery came after the decision had already been made, after the distance between them had already been created, Gabriel began to understand that what he had been interpreting as a simple choice was something far more complicated, something shaped by timing, by fear, by the uncertainty of what would happen if she turned back. And then came the part that broke through everything else, the reason behind her silence, the reason she chose to carry this alone instead of coming back, because it wasn't just about the pregnancy. It was about what she believed would happen if she told him. It was about the version of him she had come to understand over time, the man who valued control, who prioritized building, who believed that staying meant commitment, but didn't always see what was being lost in the process. And in her mind, telling him wouldn't have brought them back together in the way she needed. It would have created something else entirely. She believed he would choose his empire over her again. That belief, whether it was right or wrong, had shaped every decision she made after leaving. It had convinced her that coming back would only repeat the same pattern, that even something as significant as a child wouldn't be enough to change the way he saw the world. And so she chose silence. She chose distance. She chose to carry the weight of it alone rather than risk being disappointed in the same way twice. And hearing that, standing there with the full truth finally in front of him, Gabriel felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time. Not confusion, not anger, but a quiet, heavy realization of what had been lost in the space between what he believed he was giving and what she actually needed. In that moment, it wasn't just about the child. It wasn't just about the past 10 months. It was about the years leading up to it, the moments he overlooked, the signals he didn't recognize, the ways in which he had built a life that made sense to him but left her feeling unseen. And as the reality of it settled in, the weight of regret, of miscommunication, of time that couldn't be taken back, became impossible to ignore, because the truth she had hidden wasn't just something that explained her absence. It was something that revealed a deeper fracture, one that had existed long before she walked away, one that had quietly shaped everything that followed. But that wasn't the truth that broke him, because as heavy as everything he had just learned felt, as much as it forced Gabriel Stone to confront the past in a way he never had before, there was still something in Norah James's expression that told him the story wasn't complete, something in the way she held herself, like she was standing on the edge of saying something she had kept buried even deeper than everything else. And for a brief moment, he thought he had reached the end of it, that the hardest part was already behind him, until she looked at him in a way she hadn't since that night 10 months ago, not guarded, not distant, but honest in a way that carried its own kind of weight. What she told him next didn't come with hesitation, but it didn't come easily either, because this wasn't just another piece of the truth. This was the part she had been protecting the most, not just from him, but from the possibility of what it would mean if he knew. And as she explained it, as the reality of her situation unfolded in a way he hadn't anticipated, Gabriel felt the ground beneath everything he thought he understood begin to shift again, because the pregnancy she was carrying wasn't just unexpected. It wasn't just something she had chosen to face alone. It was complicated, fragile in ways that made every decision feel heavier. She had been dealing with a high-risk condition, something that turned what should have been a moment of hope into something uncertain, something that required constant attention, constant care, something that came with the kind of risks she didn't want to place on anyone else, especially not him, not when she believed that doing so would change the nature of his choices, would make him feel obligated in a way that had nothing to do with how he truly felt. And in her mind, that was something she couldn't accept, not after everything that had already happened between them. At the same time, the reality of her situation had forced her into circumstances she never imagined for herself, financial strain that grew with every passing month, decisions made out of necessity rather than desire, a life that looked nothing like the one she once had. And yet through all of it, she made the same choice over and over again, to keep the truth from him, not because it didn't matter, but because it mattered too much, because she didn't want to take away his ability to choose freely, even if that meant carrying the consequences alone. And when she finally said it, when the weight of everything she had been holding back came down to a single, quiet sentence, it didn't sound like an accusation. It didn't sound like regret. It sounded like something far more honest. I didn't want you to come back out of guilt. I wanted you to choose me. And in that moment, Gabriel understood that this had never just been about what happened. It had been about why it happened, about the way she saw him, about the way she believed his priorities would shape his decisions, and whether or not that belief was fair no longer mattered, because it had already influenced everything that followed. For Gabriel, standing there with the full truth finally in front of him, the realization wasn't immediate. It settled in slowly, piece by piece, as he began to see not just her choices, but his own, the patterns he hadn't questioned, the ways in which he had defined success so clearly that everything else became secondary. And for the first time, he was faced with something he couldn't solve, something he couldn't control, a moment that required more than logic, more than planning. It required a decision that would define what came next. He could step forward, close the distance, choose to be present in a way he hadn't been before, accept everything that came with that choice, and try to rebuild something that had already been broken once. Or he could remain where he was, held back by the weight of what had already been lost, by the understanding that some moments don't wait to be corrected, they pass. And when they do, they take something with them that can't always be recovered. And as the silence between them stretched, as the reality of everything they had said lingered in the space they shared, Norah didn't wait for an answer that might not come. She had already made her choice once, and she understood what it meant to walk away. So with a quiet resolve that mirrored the night she left, she stepped back, creating a distance that felt familiar and final at the same time, leaving Gabriel standing there with the truth he had been searching for, a truth that had finally been revealed, but not in a way that gave him clarity, in a way that forced him to confront what he had missed when it mattered most. Sometimes the truth doesn't set you free. Sometimes it shows you what you've already lost. And now the question is no longer about what happened. It's about what it all means, because stories like this don't end when the truth is revealed. They stay with you. They make you reflect. They force you to look at the choices made from both sides and decide where you stand. And if you were Gabriel Stone, standing in that moment with everything laid out in front of you, would you have made a different choice? Would you have seen the signs earlier? Would you have listened more closely when it mattered? Or would you have followed the same path, believing that there would always be time to fix what felt temporary? And what about Norah James? Do you think she was right to keep something so life-changing to herself, to carry that weight alone in order to protect what she believed was his freedom to choose? Or do you think she took something away from him, a chance to be present, a chance to step up, a chance to prove that he could be more than the version of him she had come to expect? Because the truth is, there isn't one simple answer. And that's what makes stories like this stay with us long after they end. So take a moment and share your thoughts. Where do you stand in this story? Because your perspective might be completely different from someone else watching. And that's exactly what makes these conversations worth having. And if you think this story was complicated, wait until you hear what happened when a man discovered his wife had been lying to him for 15 years. A story where the truth didn't just change one life. It unraveled everything he thought he knew about the person he trusted the most.